During decades, military archives kept this story in total secrecy. No soldier who participated wanted to talk about what really happened that night in Ramitelli, Italy. But today, you're going to discover why. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel for more daily documentaries. Ready? Now turn up the volume and let's begin. The first reports arrived at German High Command in the early morning hours of March 24, 1944. Luftwaffe pilots returning from encounters over the Mediterranean theater were reporting something unusual, something that contradicted everything the Nazi leadership had been led to believe. The reports described American fighter planes with distinctive red-painted tails, executing maneuvers of exceptional precision, protecting bomber formations with unprecedented effectiveness, and engaging German aircraft with tactical superiority. What made these reports particularly disturbing to the German command was the intelligence suggesting these pilots were black Americans, men who, according to the racist ideology of both Nazi Germany and segregated America, should have been incapable of such achievements. When the first intelligence summaries reached Berlin, they were initially dismissed as exaggerations or misidentifications. After all, according to the prevailing beliefs of the time, black men lacked the intellectual capacity, quick reflexes, and courage necessary for aerial combat. This view was not exclusive to Nazi Germany. It had been the official position of the United States Army Air Corps until just a few years earlier. The evidence, however, continued to mount. Squadron after squadron reported encounters with these red-tailed P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, whose pilots demonstrated not just competence, but excellence in the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., commander of the 332nd Fighter Group, later known as the Red Tails, had been fighting battles on two fronts since the inception of what would become known as the Tuskegee experiment. A West Point graduate and son of the first black general in the United States Army, Davis faced racism within the military establishment while simultaneously preparing his men to face the Luftwaffe. The training program at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama had been established in 1941 after intense pressure from civil rights organizations and President Roosevelt's administration, but it was designed with the expectation of failure. Military leadership, particularly in the South, could not conceive of black pilots successfully completing the rigorous training required for combat aviation. Lieutenant Colonel Noel Parrish, the white commander of Tuskegee Army Airfield, wrote in his private journal, "These men arrive at training with twice the determination of their white counterparts. They understand that they are not just flying for themselves, or even for their country. They are flying to disprove a theory of racial inferiority that has followed them their entire lives." This journal would not be published until 1958. Long after the war had ended and the achievements of the Tuskegee Airmen had been quietly filed away in military archives. The journey from training in Alabama to combat in the European theater was fraught with obstacles deliberately placed in the path of the black airmen. Even after completing the same training as white pilots, the graduates of Tuskegee were initially relegated to coastal patrol duties, far from the combat zones where they could prove their worth. It was only after persistent advocacy and the pressing need for fighter escorts for bombing missions that the 332nd Fighter Group was finally deployed to Italy in 1943. First Lieutenant Charles Hall became the first Tuskegee Airman to shoot down an enemy aircraft on July 2, 1943. His victory over a Focke-Wulf 190 was noted in military dispatches but received little public attention in the United States. By early 1944, however, the achievements of the Red Tails could no longer be ignored, at least not by the enemy they faced in the skies. German pilots began to take note of the distinctive red-tailed aircraft and the skill with which they were flown. According to declassified intelligence reports compiled after the war, the first mention of the black pilots in German military communications occurred in January 1944. A Luftwaffe wing commander reported, "The Americans are now deploying Negro pilots in combat operations. Their aircraft are distinguished by red-painted tail assemblies. Despite expectations, these pilots demonstrate remarkable aggression and tactical awareness." This report was forwarded up the chain of command, eventually reaching Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe. Göring initially dismissed the reports, reportedly telling his staff, "The Americans must be truly desperate if they are sending their Negroes to fight for them." This dismissal aligned with Nazi racial ideology, which placed black individuals at the bottom of their constructed racial hierarchy. However, as losses mounted and more reports confirmed the effectiveness of the Red Tails, the German High Command was forced to acknowledge the reality that contradicted their ideological assumptions. By March 1944, the reputation of the Red Tails had grown to the point that bomber crews specifically requested their escort. While white fighter groups occasionally left bomber formations to pursue enemy aircraft, seeking the glory of aerial victories, the pilots of the 332nd stayed with their bombers, prioritizing their protective mission over personal achievement. This dedication resulted in one of the best escort records of the war, with remarkably few bombers lost under their protection. The German intelligence corps began collecting more detailed information on these pilots, attempting to understand how their performance could contradict established racial theories. A report dated April 12, 1944, compiled by Luftwaffe intelligence officer Major Anton Wackernagel, was sent directly to Reich Ministry of Aviation. It contained detailed observations of the tactics employed by the Red Tails and attempted to provide explanations for their success that would not contradict Nazi racial ideology. The report suggested that these must be specially selected individuals, exceptions to what they believed was the rule, or that they had received more intensive training than other American pilots. What was not included in official German documentation, but would later be revealed through interviews with captured Luftwaffe pilots, was a growing reluctance to engage with the red-tailed aircraft. One German pilot, Kurt Schulze, told his American interrogators after being shot down in May 1944, "We began to recognize the red tails and their flight patterns. Some pilots started to avoid those sections of the bomber formations protected by them. They were simply too effective." It was on March 24, 1944, that the Red Tails executed one of their most impressive operations. Escorting B-17 Flying Fortresses on a bombing run to Berlin, they encountered a large formation of Messerschmitt 109 fighters. In the ensuing battle, the Tuskegee Airmen shot down 3 enemy aircraft without losing a single bomber. The engagement was noted in both American and German records, though with different emphases. The American report celebrated the victory. The German report struggled to explain the defeat. According to a memoir written in 1962 by former Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, this report eventually reached Hitler himself during a military briefing at the Berghof, his residence in the Bavarian Alps. What Hitler allegedly said upon learning that black pilots had outfought his Luftwaffe would become one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, not because of its military significance, but because of what it revealed about the fundamental contradiction between Nazi ideology and observable reality. The document that contained Hitler's alleged response disappeared from military archives sometime between 1945 and 1947 during the chaotic period of occupation and reconstruction. Whether it was deliberately removed, destroyed, or simply lost in the administrative shuffle of post-war Germany remains unknown. What is known, through interviews with staff present at the briefing, is that Hitler's reaction was uncharacteristically subdued, a sign that those who knew him interpreted as profound disturbance. Colonel Ludwig Weber, an aide to Galland who was present at the briefing, later told American intelligence officers, "The Führer became very quiet when he read that report. He dismissed everyone except Goering and Goebbels." Whatever was said in that private conversation never left that room, but afterward there was a directive that no further specific mention of the race of American pilots was to be included in official reports. This statement was recorded in 1947, but was not declassified until 1966. While the bombers returned to their bases in England, the pilots of the 332nd headed back to their airfield in Ramitelli, Italy, unaware of the consternation they had caused in the highest echelons of Nazi leadership. For them, it had been another mission, another day of proving through action what words alone could not establish in a segregated military and a divided nation, that courage, skill, and dedication were human qualities, not racial ones. The success of the Tuskegee Airmen came at a high cost. By the end of World War II, 66 pilots from the program had been killed in combat or accidents, and 32 had been taken prisoner of war. Each loss was felt deeply within the close-knit community of the 332nd, but their collective achievement could be measured not just in enemy aircraft destroyed, but in bombers protected and lives saved. As Allied forces pushed into Germany in 1945, documents were captured, sorted, and analyzed. Intelligence officers specifically sought information regarding the German assessment of various Allied units, including the Red Tails. What they discovered were assessments that contradicted the prejudices of many in the American military establishment. The German military, despite its adherence to Nazi racial ideology, had been forced by practical reality to acknowledge the skill and effectiveness of the black pilots they faced in combat. A Luftwaffe tactical assessment, dated December 3, 1944, found in captured documents stated, "The American Colored Pursuit Squadron with their red-tailed aircraft have proven themselves to be effective combat pilots. Their tactics indicate thorough training and high morale. Engagement with these units should be conducted with caution and numerical advantage whenever possible." The document was translated and forwarded to Army Air Forces headquarters in Washington, but was not widely circulated or acknowledged. Despite their distinguished combat record, 112 aerial victories, 3 distinguished unit citations, and more than 744 combat missions, the Tuskegee Airmen returned home to a nation still divided by segregation. Their achievements were not widely celebrated in American media, and the full impact of their service would not be recognized for decades. The military establishment, having been proven wrong about the capabilities of black pilots, seemed more interested in burying this evidence than acknowledging it. Help us bring this story to more people. Like the video, comment if you already knew about this case, and subscribe to the channel. Now, we return to the point where everything changed. In the spring of 1945, as the European War approached its conclusion, officials from the Army Air Forces conducted a comprehensive review of combat effectiveness among fighter groups. The results were striking. The 332nd had one of the lowest loss rates of bombers under their protection. Yet, these findings were classified and not integrated into the broader narrative of the air war. The question of why such impressive achievements were minimized rather than celebrated points to the uncomfortable reality of racial politics in 1940s America. Lieutenant Colonel John Myers, who conducted part of the effectiveness review, wrote in his personal correspondence, "The data speaks for itself, yet there seems to be a reluctance to acknowledge what it tells us. If we accept that these men performed as well as, or better than, many white fighter groups, then we must question the foundations upon which our segregated military is built." This letter, written to a colleague in June 1945, was not made public until 1969, when Myers donated his papers to a university archive. The end of the war brought demobilization and the return of the Tuskegee Airmen to civilian life. Many had hoped that their service would lead to changes in military policy and American society. Captain William Campbell, who flew 106 combat missions, told a reporter for the Chicago Defender in September 1945, "We did everything they said we couldn't do. We flew the same planes, followed the same rules of engagement, faced the same enemy. The only difference was the color of our skin, and that made no difference in the sky." The article ran in the black press, but received little attention in mainstream white newspapers. While the pilots themselves returned to a segregated America, the documents related to their service, particularly those captured from German sources, followed a complex and often obscure path through military archives. The original report containing Hitler's alleged reaction to the black pilot's success was last verified as being in the possession of Army counterintelligence in November 1945. After that, its location becomes uncertain. Dr. Eleanor Richards, a historian who began researching the Tuskegee Airmen in the early 1960s, found evidence that certain documents related to German assessments of black combat pilots had been deliberately separated from the main body of captured intelligence material. In a research note dated March 17, 1963, she wrote, "There appears to be a pattern of selective archiving regarding materials that contradict pre-war assumptions about racial capabilities. Documents that should be filed with other Luftwaffe tactical assessments are instead scattered across multiple classification levels and storage facilities, making a comprehensive review nearly impossible." The dispersal of these documents coincided with the post-war debate over military segregation. President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, which officially desegregated the armed forces, was met with significant resistance within the military establishment. Acknowledging the full extent of the Tuskegee Airmen's achievements would have provided powerful ammunition for those arguing in favor of integration, a fact not lost on those who controlled access to military records. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had commanded the 332nd Fighter Group, continued his military career after the war, eventually becoming the first black general in the United States Air Force. In his memoir, published in 1991, he wrote about the frustration of knowing that the true story of his men was not being told. "We had proven ourselves in combat, but now we had to prove ourselves in memory. The record was there, but few wanted to see it. It was as if our experience contradicted a story America was telling itself about who could and could not serve with distinction." The question of what Hitler actually said, when presented with evidence that black pilots were outfighting his Luftwaffe, remained unanswered in official records. However, interviews conducted with former Nazi officials during the Nuremberg trials and subsequent denazification proceedings provide some clues. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, mentioned in a 1947 interrogation that Hitler had become increasingly irrational when confronted with evidence that contradicted his racial theories. The specific incident of the Tuskegee Airmen was not mentioned in this interview, but the pattern Speer described aligns with other accounts. Heinz Guderian, former chief of the German General Staff, noted in his memoirs published in 1952, Hitler's racial views clouded his military judgment in numerous instances. When presented with evidence that contradicted his preconceptions about various racial groups, he would either dismiss the information outright or construct elaborate explanations that preserved his worldview while acknowledging the immediate tactical reality. Again, no specific mention of the black American pilots was made, likely due to the selective memory of a former Nazi general keen to distance himself from the regime's racist ideology. The most direct account comes from the previously mentioned Colonel Ludwig Weber, who claimed to have been present when the report on the red-tailed fighters reached Hitler. In addition to his 1947 statement to American intelligence, Weber gave a more detailed account to a German journalist in 1958. In this later interview, he claimed that Hitler had initially raged against the contamination of the American Air Force, but then became coldly analytical, suggesting that these black pilots must be special cases who had been given extraordinary training and equipment to create propaganda victories. Weber's account must be treated with caution, as it emerged more than a decade after the events described and cannot be verified through official documentation. The absence of the original document allegedly containing Hitler's reaction is itself significant. Throughout the Cold War, both American and Soviet intelligence agencies combed through captured Nazi archives for information that might serve their respective propaganda efforts. A document showing Hitler's dismay at being outfought by black pilots would have been valuable for American civil rights advocacy and international propaganda, particularly in Africa and Asia, where the US was competing with the Soviet Union for influence among newly independent nations. The fact that no such document was ever publicly produced suggests either that it was destroyed, remained classified for other reasons, or that the story of Hitler's reaction had been exaggerated in post-war accounts. Dr. Richards continued her research throughout the 1960s, filing numerous Freedom of Information Act requests and interviewing surviving members of the Tuskegee Airmen as well as former intelligence officers. Her notes, archived at Howard University, document a pattern of institutional resistance to fully acknowledging the achievements of the black pilots. In a 1967 letter to a colleague, she wrote, "The more I dig, the more convinced I become that there was a deliberate effort to minimize the success of the 332nd. The question is whether this was a matter of individual prejudice among key officials or a more systematic policy decision." While the specific words Hitler may have uttered remained elusive, the broader German military assessment of the Tuskegee Airmen became clearer as more documents were declassified. A comprehensive Luftwaffe report from February 1945, discovered in Soviet archives and returned to Germany in the 1990s, included a section on enemy fighter tactics by unit type. The entry on the 332nd noted, "This unit demonstrates exceptional discipline in bomber escort operations. Pilots maintain tight formation and prioritize protective duties over pursuit of individual targets. Engagement should be conducted only when numerical superiority is assured or when they can be separated from bomber groups." What makes this assessment particularly significant is that it evaluates the Red Tails purely on their combat effectiveness, with no mention of race. By early 1945, whatever Hitler and his inner circle might have said about black pilots in private, the operational reality had forced German tactical planning to acknowledge and respect the capabilities of the Tuskegee Airmen without racial qualification. For the men who had served in the 332nd, the post-war years brought a mix of pride in their achievements and frustration at the lack of recognition. Many used their veteran status and aviation experience to push for changes in civilian aviation, challenging segregation in airlines and airports. Others pursued careers and education opportunities opened by the GI Bill, becoming part of the professional class that would later support the civil rights movement. Captain William Campbell, previously quoted from his 1945 interview, went on to become a physics teacher. In 1963, he spoke to a reporter about the long-term impact of his service. What we proved in the air over Europe wasn't just that black men could fly combat missions. We proved that segregation itself was inefficient, wasteful, and ultimately self-defeating for America. That was the real threat our success posed to the old order, and why I believe so many were uncomfortable with our story being told. The story of what happened in the skies over Europe and in the classified reports that traveled between military headquarters remained fragmented and partially hidden for decades. It was not until the 1970s and 80s, as military records were declassified and scholarly interest in black military history increased, that a more complete picture began to emerge. Even then, certain documents remained missing, classified, or otherwise inaccessible. In 1968, a former German intelligence officer named Kurt Schulze, who had emigrated to Canada after the war, gave an interview to a Toronto newspaper in which he claimed to have seen the actual report containing Hitler's reaction. According to Schulze, the Führer first questioned the accuracy of the report, suggesting it must be American propaganda. When assured that multiple reliable sources had confirmed the effectiveness of these black pilots, he fell into one of his rages, blaming Göring for the failure of the Luftwaffe to maintain air superiority. After this outburst, he became eerily calm and instructed that all future reports should refer to these units by their numerical designation only, with no mention of race. Schulze's account cannot be independently verified, and like many post-war recollections from former Nazi officials, it must be approached with skepticism. However, it aligns with other accounts of Hitler's typical response pattern when confronted with evidence that contradicted his ideological beliefs. Initial denial, followed by rage, followed by a restructuring of information flow to minimize cognitive dissonance. The Tuskegee Airmen themselves were more concerned with their place in American history than with Hitler's reaction to their success. As Colonel Davis wrote in his memoir, "We were fighting for the right to fight for our country. What the enemy thought of us was far less important than what our own country thought of us. The real battle wasn't over Berlin. It was over what kind of America would exist after the war." By the time Dr. Richards completed her research in the early 1970s, she had compiled substantial evidence of the Tuskegee Airmen's exceptional combat record and the subsequent minimization of their achievements. Her book, Red Tails, The Untold Story of the Tuskegee Airmen, published in 1973, was one of the first scholarly works to fully document their contribution to the air war in Europe. However, she was never able to locate the missing document allegedly containing Hitler's direct response. In the conclusion to her book, Richards wrote, "Perhaps it doesn't matter what Hitler said when he learned that black pilots had outfought his Luftwaffe. What matters is what America did when confronted with the same evidence. Hitler's regime was destroyed, in part by the very men his ideology dismissed as inferior. But the America these men fought for continued to struggle with its own contradictions, celebrating victory over fascism abroad while maintaining racial hierarchy at home. The true measure of the Tuskegee Airmen's victory would not be found in a German document, but in the long, unfinished journey toward equality in the nation they served." The 1970s and 80s saw increased public interest in the Tuskegee Airmen, partly due to the civil rights movement and partly due to the efforts of the airmen themselves to preserve their legacy. In 1972, they formed the Tuskegee Airmen, Inc., an organization dedicated to honoring the accomplishments and perpetuating the history of black Americans who participated in the Army Air Corps during World War II. Through their advocacy, more records were declassified, more stories were told, and their place in military history began to be more widely acknowledged. In 1995, half a century after the end of World War II, new information emerged from an unexpected source. The fall of the Soviet Union and the opening of formerly inaccessible archives led to the discovery of captured German documents that had been taken to Moscow in 1945. Among these was a partial transcript of a meeting between Hitler, Göring, and other high-ranking Nazi officials dated April 2, 1944, just over a week after the March 24th mission in which the Red Tails had so distinguished themselves. The transcript, which was authenticated by historians but is incomplete, contains a discussion of unexpected developments in the air war. Hitler is quoted as saying, "If these reports are accurate, then it represents a failure not just of intelligence, but of understanding." How is it possible that these men, whom science has proven to be subhuman, can operate complex machinery with such effectiveness? Goering's response is partially missing from the transcript, but Hitler continues. This is precisely the kind of American propaganda that Goebbels has warned about. They are attempting to undermine the fundamental principles of our worldview by creating these exceptions. The transcript breaks off at this point, and the remainder of the meeting is not recorded or has not been found. While this document does not contain the specific quote that has been the subject of speculation for decades, it does confirm that the success of the Tuskegee Airmen reached the highest levels of Nazi leadership and created significant ideological dissonance. Hitler's reference to exceptions suggests the beginning of a cognitive restructuring, a way to acknowledge the tactical reality while preserving the broader ideological framework of racial hierarchy. For the surviving Tuskegee Airmen, now in their 70s and 80s, by the time this document emerged, it provided additional validation of what they had known all along, that their excellence in combat had been so undeniable that even their most ideologically opposed enemies had been forced to acknowledge it. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Jefferson, who had been shot down and held as a prisoner of war, commented in a 1997 interview, "We didn't need Hitler's words to know what we had accomplished. We knew it when we returned from missions, when bomber crews requested us as escorts, when our fellow pilots, white and black, acknowledged our skill. But there is a certain satisfaction in knowing that even the architect of the most racist regime in modern history could not deny what we had done in the air." As the 20th century drew to a close, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen gradually moved from the margins to the mainstream of American military history. In 2007, they were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in recognition of their unique military service and contribution to the desegregation of the armed forces and American society. The citation acknowledged not only their combat record, but the broader impact of their example in challenging racial stereotypes and advancing civil rights. The search for what Hitler said when he learned that black pilots had outfought his Luftwaffe may never yield a definitive answer. Documents have been lost, memories have faded, and those who might have had direct knowledge have passed away. But perhaps the more important question is not what Hitler said, but what the Tuskegee Airmen did, not just in combat against the Luftwaffe, but in their lifelong battle against segregation and discrimination in the country they served with such distinction. In their red-tailed P-51s, they had proven that courage, skill, and dedication knew no color line. On the ground, they continued that fight through the post-war years, the civil rights era, and beyond. Their legacy lives not just in military history, but in the broader American journey toward fulfilling its founding promise of equality, a journey that continues to this day. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen reminds us that history is not just about what is recorded in official documents, but what is lived in human experience. The missing words of a defeated dictator matter far less than the enduring example of the men he underestimated. They flew against both enemy aircraft and the headwinds of prejudice, achieving victory in the skies over Europe, even as the battle for equality at home continued. In the words of Brigadier General Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., spoken at a reunion of the Tuskegee Airmen in 1990, "We did not win all our battles, but we never lost our honor or our faith in America. What we achieved in combat was important, but what we represented was even more so. The capacity of American democracy to change, to improve, to live up to its ideals. That is the true legacy of the Red Tails." Did you enjoy this story? Your support helps us continue producing new documentaries. A like, a comment, or a share makes all the difference. See more historical cases on our channel, and if you're not subscribed yet, join our community. I'll see you in the next episode.